Hi, my name is Cecil Walker,
And I am Adam Frower.
and this is Possibilities. Today we're going to be talking about how to increase self-esteem. And I think maybe a good place to start, Adam, is by defining what self-esteem is. How do you were a professor, so you had to teach these kinds of things to people. How do you succinctly define what self-esteem is?
First, I would say self-esteem has been defined probably 100 different ways. So I'll give a beginning definition, and I'm sure as we go, it'll kind of build and morph as we go. But I think as the word implies, it's obviously something about myself, how I think, feel, believe about myself. And then esteem is just thinking about that word, like how you hold yourself, right? We would say, I hold that person in high esteem or in high regard. And so I would say, in some sense, it kind of boils down to how do we hold ourselves? Like, what opinion do we have of ourselves? I'll stop with that really simple, basic answer.
No, I think that's helpful. How do you best describe then why this is something people have talked about a lot for, I think, a long while. I remember, like, elementary school, they would make a big deal of you gotta have self-esteem and work on self-esteem. There's all PSAs and self-help books and all this kind of stuff. Why is it so important in the first place? To even be aware of it, to work on it, to have it?
That's a big question, and I'm just going to be honest. I think part of me says maybe it's really, really important, and there's another part of me that's like, maybe not so important. So I'll try to explain both of those, and then again, maybe we can navigate through as we go. But I think on the one hand, the way that we view ourselves, the way that we kind of think about ourselves, the way that we, again, kind of hold ourselves, it influences lots of things. But at the same time, it's kind of like a chicken and an egg. Does the way that I think about myself change the way I behave, or does the way that I behave influence the way I think? So again, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. So I think it would be worthwhile for us to say, like, our perception of ourselves is constantly malleable. It's constantly changing. It's from one situation to another situation. We may have higher or a lower sense of self. But I think if we kind of get to the place of looking at the overall trend, and we say, do I tend to view myself, I'm just going to say up here, in a way of like, I feel good about myself, I believe good things about myself, I have confidence in my abilities, those kinds of things, or do I tend to have self-doubt or self-criticism, or even some people might go as far as like self-hatred. That really, I think, can make a difference when we kind of get at that like overall trend perspective. Because at that point, then it impacts, I guess I would say, everything. It impacts my internal state, it impacts like how I feel, but it also influences how I behave to and with other people. If I don't feel good about myself, that's going to come across in the way that I treat other people or the way I perceive them treating me. And so, on the one hand, I think it makes a huge difference. And then if I shift over and I say, well, maybe it doesn't make that much difference at all, it's, I think, again, it kind of comes back to that chicken and the egg. Because I could just go out into the world and I could behave in a kind, compassionate, empathetic way, and then I will receive those things in return. And by receiving those things in turn, I will feel better. I will have a higher sense of positivity and hopefulness and all of those kinds of things that maybe didn't originate from me, but might have originated from, what comes back my way. And so I think in some sense, if we get too hyper-focused on, like, how do I make this happen, we could get in our own way of having it happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Almost too much sense, because it's a lot of things to, I think, pull out of there. I do really like your highlighting this link between how we feel about ourselves, how we think about ourselves, and how we respond then to ourselves, or how we interact with the world, with other people, with situations that are happening in our lives. And I think it's very much just like what we think of another person. If I have a positive regard for someone, if I feel good about someone, if I like that person, trust that person, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to be less suspicious of them. I'm going to think when they do things, there's probably good, positive intent behind it, or at least a lack of malicious intent behind it. I'm going to maybe even think a bit more positively of the things that they do. My valuing or judgment of them will just somehow have an extra boost if I have this kind of positive regard for them, compared to if I have a negative regard for someone, I dislike someone, or that's someone I want to avoid, or for whatever reason I distrust that person. They could do something innocuous and I might be more suspicious of that innocuous thing, or I might just automatically, without them even prompting it, have negative thoughts about them. And I think the exact same thing could be true about ourselves. We might, if we have low or poor self-esteem, we might be more suspicious of ourselves. Why did you mess up in that kind of way? Those mistakes feel less forgivable. Are you guilty of such and such? We might question ourselves and dig around in those kinds of ways, as opposed to either giving ourselves the benefit of doubt and not thinking about these types of malicious things at all, or even being even further more positive and thinking, wow, I worked really hard, and this is a great outcome. I can think positively about these kinds of things. So I think there's a really close connection to be seen, not only between our perspective of ourselves and then how we interact with ourselves and the things that we're doing, but even thinking of it kind of in comparison to how do we interact with other people? What do we think of other people? Because we have to work, I think, on a relationship with ourselves in a similar kind of a way that we might have to be intentional about relationships with other people.
Yeah, I think that is a really valuable way of thinking about it, is our own relationship with ourselves. And I'm not sure that we oftentimes think about that, of like, I'm in a relationship with myself. And so I think that's really valuable. One of the questions that came up for me, like as I was listening to you, is that some might argue that a lot of those thoughts that I have about myself, or a lot of those beliefs that I hold about myself, they just like happen. That I don't really have control or the ability, like I just all of a sudden find myself like having these critical thoughts or kind of engaging in this self-loathing or whatever, and it's almost like I don't even catch that it's happening. It just is happening outside of my awareness. So I guess first of all, what do you make of that? And second of all, if that's true or if that's not true, what do you do about it?
I could agree with that either these thoughts happen unintentionally or without our consent, without our choosing, or it's so quick and hard to control that it's just overwhelmingly difficult to not have certain thoughts if they do come up so instantly. I could agree with that, but where we do have, I think, a ton of control and a ton of intentionality is what we make of those things when they do come up. The same way I have no control over what you might say next, I absolutely can control what do I say in response to what you say. So what do I say in response to the thoughts that come up? Some thoughts that come up aren't worth acting on, aren't worth speaking out loud, aren't worth doing anything with. And some thoughts very much are. Some thoughts need to be worked on. They need to be edited. They need to be evaluated for what's the use in this or the value in this. How can I use this in a constructive way? Is that useful to me at all? Do I even agree with the things that are coming up in those thoughts? So I think that very much is the door to where that agency comes into play, where you can start to be able to say you have a say in what you think of yourself and how you value yourself. But you could go even deeper, I think, into evaluating what are your beliefs that are connected to what you think of yourself. What are your beliefs about people, about you, the life that you're living, the things that you're doing, your decision making. Maybe what are your beliefs about your purpose and the track that you're on, and how these things might line up and start to either add together in a sense of, okay, I'm doing things that I value and that are good, and I'm working on myself in a way that I can be pleased with. So I think there's a wealth of things to be intentional about, including how do I respond to the thoughts that come up? Because if I have a coworker that I really dislike and I don't want to spend time with them, or I'm annoyed by them, or I just don't trust them or something like that, and we have to work together on something, I don't get to just blurt out every thought that comes to mind. I don't get to let all those thoughts and feelings just take over that interaction. I have to try to still be constructive and productive. I have to do what I need to do. And so, yeah, like I was saying earlier, that same type of, we put so much work into relationships, even relationships that are hard, maybe particularly relationships that are hard. Mm-hmm. So why shouldn't we put, that much work into our relationship with ourselves too?
Yeah, you made me think of a couple of things I'll try to highlight, but one of the things that I think is really valuable is like when I ask that question of like what happens when these things just like happen and it's outside of my awareness, one of the things that does is that it like really hones us in on a particular moment, and that one moment, that one thought or that series of thoughts becomes kind of hyper focused. We kind of zoom in on that thing. And I think one of the things that you made me think about is like there's value in zooming out a bit and in saying like using intentionality mm-hmm. to say, first of all, what kind of person do I want to be? If I had this self-esteem, if I had this self-regard that I want, what does that mean? What does that look like? What is that? And outlining that. So again, it's like taking yourself out of that moment and saying, when these thoughts and feelings and whatever are happening, I'm going to take myself over here for a second and be really deliberate and intentional about saying, well, what kind of person do I want to see myself being? That in and of itself, walking through that exercise, and I would even say like deliberately writing down, like detailing, well, when I have the self-esteem that I'm hoping for, when I have the self-regard that I'm hoping for, I'll do these kinds of things. I'll associate with these kinds of people. I'll have these kinds of thoughts. I'll experience these kinds of feelings. Outlining that then gives you something in that moment when you zoom back in to counter it mm-hmm. and to say, that might be happening. I might be having that thought, but what kind of person do I want to be? I can pull out that list or I can pull up that mental image and I can say, actually, this is who I'm striving to be. And so pulling out, I think, is important. I think the other thing that you kind of made me think of is thinking about it along a timeline, right? There's a past, there's a present, mm-hmm. there's a future. And again, when those things are happening, I zoom in and I'm like hyper-focused on this particular moment. And zooming out again to consider, well, have I always been like this? Or are there times in my past where things were quite different, when I had the success that I wanted, or I achieved certain things that I wanted to achieve, or I was the kind of person that I had valued? Or again, kind of using that mental image that we created before to look forward and to say, what steps am I taking that are moving me in that direction? And so again, I think there's value in kind of putting it on a timeline, because oftentimes when we become really self-critical or when we feel our self-esteem is lower than we want it to be, there's an intense focus on this particular moment, or there's an exaggeration of what happened in the past. Like, I've always been this kind of a person. Or there's a belief of like, well, I'll never be anything different than this. And so I think part of the process of gaining self-esteem is really kind of broadening perspective to say there's something way bigger than this particular moment that can counter these feelings or these thoughts or these emotions that I'm having.
Yeah, I really like that, because it introduces a much more accurate amount of nuance into the conceptualization of yourself. You're not just this one moment. You're not just that one thing you might be judging yourself for. You're not just that shortcoming or that trait that you might dislike or whatever it is. You are, this growing, living thing that has this full narrative. And one narrative even of itself can't fully define you. You're like this collision of multiple narratives all kind of knotted together. And so looking at it, zooming out in that kind of way, looking at it from all those different angles and using the past, present, and future in that kind of a way, I think is a much more human way actually to look at a person, which I think pulls me to the thing that my first response to the question of how do you build self-esteem, my go-to thing that I think of is it, or at least for me, it relies on a foundation of what I think about people in general. Like there's a bedrock of how low I can go in terms of thinking of any person, including myself. And I think that foundation is made up of, what do you believe about people? Are all people inherently valuable? Are all people inherently worthy of that benefit of the doubt that we were talking about earlier, of an assumption of we're all here just trying to live life and do the best that we can. We're all dealing with whatever struggles that we're dealing with in whatever ways that we've been able to find to deal with those ways. Some of those ways are less beneficial and less kind maybe than others, but they are all just extensions of the same kind of similar experience. We're all just here trying to get through life. And so having that kind of foundational background on, here's just how I see every person, regardless of what they've done, regardless of what traits they have, regardless of maybe even how I feel about them or experiences that I've had with them, or notorious things I've heard about them. With that, I feel like I can apply that generosity that I have for other people to myself then. If I make a mistake, if I dislike how I handle the situation, or if I feel bad or upset or something like that, I can't really beat myself up in that sense, because I wouldn't do that to a friend. I wouldn't do that to a family member, a child, someone you're trying to teach and trying to see them grow into be a good, healthy person. And so the reasons that I have that care for those people, I could apply to myself too. So that I think is already like I said, there's just like very ample bedrock of self-esteem can't go below this point, because this is just what all human beings deserve in the first place.
Maybe to play devil's advocate for a second, not because I completely agree with what you said, so I want to make that really clear, but I could see somebody saying, like, I'm in a really depressed place, or life has been really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a series of traumatic things happen to me. What if I don't believe that bedrock anymore? What if I think, yeah, everybody deserves to be loved, or everybody is valuable except for me because of what I've done or because of what I've experienced? Or what if there's that, like, self-doubt of even the bedrock?
I think to find yourself in that position, you might be stuck between some contradictions. You might be saying, I feel so very depressed, I have this very low self-esteem, I don't feel like those things apply to me, but somehow you can say they apply to other people. Everyone else deserves these things, and I don't think I deserve these things. I won't get into the weeds of, whatever beliefs you have about why that applies to other people, but you exceptionally do not get those things applied to you. But the big contradiction that I'm looking at is, you are probably finding yourself saying, I want to feel better. I want to be in this place where I can deserve those things. I want to be able to look at myself and say, oh, that's a good person. I like that person, or I care about that person at the very least. And so to desire that, then that kind of like shines a tiny bit of light. It says that, like, there needs to be a way for that thing to exist. I'm wanting that thing to exist. I have some value, some meaning in that thing. And that inherently implies you must care about yourself. You must, if you want that for yourself, the same way that, like, a parent wants good things for their kid, it's like you care about that kid. You would like the future to be brighter. You would like things to work out well. You would want some goodness to come to that person. So how can you desire that for yourself, without actually having any sense of, I want good things for myself?
Yeah, one of the things that you made me think about is, again, it's another way of kind of like zooming out a bit, but you're getting at that foundational principle of, like, what do people deserve? What's the value of a person? And so whether, I know a lot of people, I guess I would put it into the camp of, like, there's meaning making that has to happen.
For sure.
Lots of people, when they look at like what's the value of a person, they might come at it from like a spiritual perspective or a religious perspective. Other people come from it just as like a humanitarian level. But I think pausing and asking yourself those questions around like, what is the value of a person? What does the life of a person mean? That then gives you an opportunity to say, so what does that mean about me? I think one of the other ways that I might suggest like going about this process is talking to other people. Talking to people who have different value systems and have created different meaning making systems and those kinds of things. And ask people like, what's the value of a person, and how do you know, regardless of what they choose, what they think, what they feel, whatever, how do you evaluate what a person is valued, or what a life means? Because hearing that from other people will give you kind of a collective view to draw from or to evaluate or say, do I agree with this or disagree with this? But I am unaware of a system or a belief system or a value system that doesn't hold any living soul at a particular level of worth. And so I think the more that you can hear that, the more that you can see that, regardless of the differing value systems, the more it reinforces most people in the world are going to look at you and say, there's something really valuable about you. And just being able to experience that from multiple people in and of itself could be a really curing, healing experience.
Yeah. I like that because it puts you in a process of like construction, like you're trying to build understanding, you're trying to build your own sense of, well, how do I answer this question? How do I piece these things together in a journey of, taking from testing and discussing some of these things with other people. And I think that and many of the other things that we've already said places agency in people's hands, which I think once you find the right amount of agency, self-esteem becomes extremely manageable. It's something you don't even have to think too much about. If you feel like you can define yourself whenever you want, however you want, in all the ways that you would like to, and you can do what you need to do to be the kind of person that you want to be, or to have the life that you want to have, or to look at yourself in the way that you want to. If you feel like you have the agency to do those things, I feel like that's like the master key to self-esteem and a whole load of other things too, including how do I respond to maybe, persistent thoughts that might pop up in my head, or this really ironed, fixed perception that I might have of myself. You can find yourself disagreeing with that and acting outside of that if you feel like you possess the agency to do those things.
Yeah, I think that I really like the idea that you just brought up around like constructing your perspective. I think another way that can add to that construction is being purposeful and going out of your way to treat other people consistent with the way that you think people deserve to be valued. I think most of the time when people are struggling with self-esteem, at least this was what I would say from my clinical work, is that a lot of the focus has shifted from the world at large or to what's happening out there to me as an individual. It's a lot of the emphasis is like shifted to now I just consider me and what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing. And the antidote to that is just shifting the direction of intention. If I can think about what somebody else might need, if I can look at what somebody else is struggling with and try to relieve that struggling in some way, if I can find a place to volunteer where people are in need of something, and I have the capacity to meet that need, I think that does two important things. One, again, it shifts the direction, and when we shift the direction, we don't have as much time to evaluate like, what's wrong with me? What's right with me? Where am I falling short? What am I? Because now I'm just trying to meet the needs of somebody else. So I think it minimizes how much self-criticism we can give ourselves. The other thing I think that it does when we shift that perspective is it's that golden rule, right? It's the treat other people the way you want to be treated, and inevitably that treatment comes back to you. And so now all of a sudden you've expanded the circle of people who can give what you're giving back. They can give gratitude, they can give appreciation, they can give love, they can give compassion, they can give, and just experiencing that and seeing how other people appreciate you inherently is going to lift that self-esteem. And so again, it could appear like a very selfish thing. If I'm going to go serve somebody else in order to get something back. But the byproduct, whether it's selfish or not, the byproduct very likely will occur.
I really like, I like all of that, especially this, a lot of the things that you've said in this discussion have been linked to an interaction with another person. And I think that's easy to overlook at how valuable that is for our own sense of self-esteem, because we can learn a lot about ourselves, or more importantly, how to treat ourselves from our interactions with other people, and not just how we're treating them and hoping they would treat us, but in if you find a genuinely good relationship, maybe with a family member, a friend, a partner, whoever, maybe even with a stranger, to see a stranger treat you, in a really pleasant, kind, generous, whatever kind of a way, that I feel like that deposits a bit of, well, maybe this is what I deserve. And if this is a really close relationship that you trust, and that you're willing to say that this person knows me well and sees me well, and they treat me like this intentionally, they treat me well and kindly and generously intentionally, maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe I am a certain value of a kind of person to them, and I should maybe borrow from that. I should maybe use some of that and say that this is how I see myself. I could see myself as well. So I think there's a lot of really inherent value in finding good relationships and good interactions for all the reasons that you mentioned, but also just because it can teach you how to see you, if you find people who do that well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I hadn't really thought about this when we started, but we as people are just inherently relational beings. And so even that term, self-esteem, is such an interesting, maybe misnomer. I'm probably going to be a really bad judge of how I should be seen, what my value is, what my, what my expertise are, what my skills are. Oftentimes, I'm much better at seeing what other people are doing and appreciating what other people are doing. And in that regard, it becomes incumbent upon me to say those things to them, like, hey, I'm so impressed that you do this thing, or I really appreciate that you gave your time to me in this way, or whatever. And so my esteem maybe is going to be miscalculated or offline, unless I'm doing what you are kind of advocating, of taking in what other people are giving me and kind of soaking in all of the positivity that I'm getting from others. And so maybe even the emphasis or the focus on self-esteem is misplaced, and perhaps we should be, building really good relationships, and inherently, when our relationships are good and sound and worthwhile, how we feel about ourselves will also just, in some sense, take care of itself, because we'll be receiving that feedback and kindness from others around us, which again is inherent because we're relational beings.
Yeah. So self-esteem might not just be how do I tend to this in myself, and how do I do all this in and for myself, but it could be, what am I doing in my relationships with other people, and what am I noticing too about my relationships with other people. Anything else about how to fix somebody's self-esteem?
I always say no, and then I go on to say one more thing. So let me just take a second, think about it. I guess one final thing is, I guess I would boil it down to, I don't know what to call it except for self-honesty. I think oftentimes when we have a low sense of self-esteem, that's actually an indication of dishonesty. Again, going back to what you said, most worldviews, most world cultures will say there is an inherent value of a person. And so if I am saying to myself, I'm valueless, I'm worthless, I am no good, I'm actually being dishonest with myself. And so I think in some sense, again, it's not about my perception so much as it is about my honesty of, no, actually I do have worth, I do have value, I do contribute positivity to the world. And so I think, I guess in a pursuit of self-esteem, I would say it might be worth looking at the level of self-honesty and saying, how accurate are you assessing who you are?
I think that's pretty powerful and speaks to how much your self-esteem is tied into how you're talking to yourself, the conversations that you're really having, and if those conversations are, like you're saying, fully genuine, fully honest. Do you really believe the things that you're saying? And when you're saying those things, are you being honest? Are you fully subscribing to, the essence of what you believe and your values and how you see the world? Because I would think people with devastatingly low self-esteem, more likely than not, aren't being honest with themselves. Okay, well, I think we solved it, as usual. Check. How to increase your self-esteem. We did it.
We did it. Hopefully that conversation stirred up some thoughts and insights for you. Perhaps you know somebody who is struggling with their self-esteem or their self-worth. And if you feel like this conversation could be useful for them, please feel free to share with them. We would love to be able to make a difference in people's lives, just like we just spent time talking about. If we can send positivity to other people, we really want to be able to do that. So share wherever applicable. In the meantime, it sounds like go live meaningful lives through relationships with others, and your self-esteem will improve.